Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Let's Dev. So, a new game was recently released, published by one of my favorite publishers ever, Devolver Digital, called Ape Out. It looks like if you were to go fists only in Hotline Miami, only instead you're an ape causing havoc to some pretty great jazz. Now, I say looks like because I'm a little light on cash and haven't actually played Ape Out for myself. But I have watched the trailers, and I do also make a series on YouTube where I make video games, so why not remake what I think Ape Out might play like? And yes, I'm entirely aware of just how sad this sounds, but while I may be poor, I am rich in imagination, so, once I can pay for life with imagination, watch out, world. Anyway, the plan for today is to remake Ape Out based on what's shown in the trailers. The primary features seem to be punching, grabbing, and shooting, so that's what we'll be focusing on. How close can we get to cloning a game we've never played? Well, there's only one way to find out, so let's not waste any more time and get to the coding. First up was the enemy. I wanted to get the grabbing mechanics working before anything else, so I set up a switch for the grab state. For now, when grabbed, the enemies would stick to and face the same direction as the player. Moving on to the player, I set up a distance check, and if an enemy happens to be within grabbing range, the player would switch to its grab state while putting the grabbed enemy into its own grab state. And if the player already has an enemy grabbed, they would then throw the enemy instead. Going back to the enemy, in order to simplify things, instead of having the enemy have a grab state of true or false, I would use it as a state of its own, having state 2 be the thrown state. While in that thrown state, the enemy would fling in the direction the player is facing, and should an enemy come into contact with a wall and they're in the thrown state, for now they'd be destroyed. Testing showed promise as everything seemed to be working exactly as we'd hoped, so it was time to dress up the destruction a bit. Brutality seems to play a pretty important part in the visual style of Ape Out, so we needed to follow suit. I created a blood object that would eventually generate a circle of random size and velocity, which would slow down over time. And to give the gore a bit of extra visual aid, I added a random splat to accompany the blood balls. The effect was okay, but it was clearly missing impact, and so I added an explosion effect, similar to one that we used in the Ultra Bugs clone. And I also added a few limbs that could show up at random, and to top it all off, of course, I added some screen shake. And before I could test if any of this actually worked, I added a conditional to the blood to have it stop moving if it hits a wall, to prevent it from going through the wall. And the results ended up being so much more deliciously gruesome thanks to the additions. It may not be as violent as the actual Ape Out, but it's violent enough. It's like diet violence. Anyway, now that our enemies could explode, there were other features to focus on. Going back to the player code, I wanted to work on the punch. Now, I could have gone with an actual hitbox sprite, but I decided to try using as few sprites as possible, as a personal challenge, I guess. Anyway, I went with a collision rectangle that would pop up in front of the ape, and if an enemy so happens to be in said collision rectangle, they would be instantly placed in the thrown state. And thanks to the way that we set up our enemy code, not much else was needed to be done here. So once again, testing showed everything working just as we'd hoped, and so that meant we could move on. Now that our player can attack, it was time to make our enemies attack. Not knowing anything about Ape Out's health system, I simply made the game a one-hit death type of game. So if the ape gets shot, that's game over. The way I decided to set up the attack for the enemy was to check for a distance first. Then if they had a clear line of sight, the enemy would fire, sending it into a cooldown state. In retrospect, I should have handled this whole thing differently. The end result worked, but it worked too well, and the enemies ended up being god tier snipers. With obvious polish in time, I could have changed things, but it's fine. This is like Hotline Miami meets Ape Out. It's like hardcore mode, super hardcore mode, super ape mode. There you go. Next, I wanted the enemies to walk around instead of being static turrets, so I set up the same pathing grid we explored in our Valentine's Day special. And so now we had moving, aiming enemies who were godly snipers, and an angry ape who will turn them into piles of bloody pulp. Not too bad so far, all things considered. We still had a few things to do though, so I pried myself away from beating up the poor sniper and got back to the code. First, I moved the death effects into their own event, which would make it far more accessible in places where we'd need it. For example, when thrown enemies hit other enemies, they'd explode just as they would if they were hitting a wall. And finally, we had the human meat shield. Going back to the player code, I tried to set up a collision line, and again, looking back, I recognize I handled this poorly. But yes, I set up another collision line based on the enemy we're grabbing, and if another enemy happens to be in our line of sight, we could shoot them with the enemy's gun. This turned out to work, but using a collision line meant that the shot had to be very specific, making it difficult to actually pull off. Again, could have handled this better, I know. But moving on, I wanted to get the meat shield part done before I ran out of time. And my first attempt overthought the situation way too much, introducing yet another collision line. Then I realized how silly that was and instead simply checked for the grab variable. This way, unless other enemies could get behind the player, they would refuse to fire their gun. And there we had it. Quirks aside, we managed to create our very own version of Ape Out made entirely based on the trailers. If you've played Ape Out, let me know just how close I got to the actual gameplay. And if I was completely off, well, we'll just say we mashed up Ape Out with Hotline Miami. Maybe Devolver will make that crossover a reality and the world will be a better place for it. Anyway, that'll do it for this episode of Let's Dev. So remember that if you like this video or enjoy Let's Dev in general, be sure to hit that like button. If you aren't already subscribed, be sure to hit that subscribe button and be sure to turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. And as always, be sure to leave your thoughts on our Ape Out clone in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.